Hello, everyone. Nice to meet you. Hello, everybody. My name is Chloe. I'm from the community team, and I help to coordinate the Math Academies for Maths. First of all, can everyone say to me if you can hear us, me, and also Chad, if you can say something,
Hello, hello.
and also if you can see our screen. Perfect. Great. So everyone can hear us and see us. So that's nice. So nice to meet everybody. So as I said, I'm part of the community team that helps to coordinate the Math Academies. And today it will be Chad who gave us the honor of hosting this Math Academies to tell us more about GitOps. And while waiting for everyone to connect and log in to this Math Academy, I'll give you a quick introduction of Maths and the purpose of this Math Academies. So the Math Academies are actually offered by Math to give its community quick access to peer-to-peer training. It actually has been created during the first lockdown, and so it gives us the opportunity to still give access to freelancers to initiate and train on different and several topics. And for those who are not maybe from Math, who don't know Math, as a reminder, so Math is a platform which connects freelancers with customers. And we are fortunate today to work with the world's largest community around Europe, especially in France, Germany, Spain, and newly Netherlands and Belgium, with over 300,000 freelancers, so quite a big community. And also, we have the chance to work with other 90,000 customers. And if you are today a freelancer, or if you are asking yourself the question to go to freelancing, you can find new opportunities with Math with actually or looking a lot for DevOps profiles. So if you are a DevOps, don't hesitate to contact us, and we may have an opportunity for you. I will now give the floor to Chad. Feel free to ask question during this presentation if you have. You have a tab on the left, which is more questions. Please put your questions in it. It will be easier for Chad to read them and answer them. And if you want to interact during the presentation, don't hesitate to put to chat in the tab chat. And Chad, I will let you go with your presentation, and enjoy, everyone.
Hey, thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I know it's at the end of all of your day. I appreciate you coming in and listening in on my talk today. I'm happy to be here. Like Chloe said, I'm going to try to keep an eye on the chat stream, but just attention-wise, it's going to be a little difficult sometimes, so I might not get to it. So just put it in the questions tab, and we'll make some time to go through them one by one at the end. So my talk for today is called GitOps, Getting the Most Out of DevOps with Declarative Infrastructure and Profiling. Kind of a long title. Some of you may be familiar with a lot of the points that I'm going to touch in the talk today, but hopefully we can all get a little something out of what GitOps is in relation to DevOps, and maybe a little bit about what Platform SH is, which is the company that I work for, and how it might help the work that you're doing. So I don't know if I said it already. My name is Chad Carlson. I work for the developer relations team at platform.sh. We are a platform as a service provider that has, Chloe and I were just talking about this, 270-ish employees all over the world. We're all distributed, and together we work on this platform as a service and a set of DevOps tools that are all built around this concept of GitOps, which is the reason for it being the subject of this talk today. So let's go ahead and get started with that. I decided to break it down initially with not quite a history, but maybe just an overview of some of the major milestones that led us to where we are when we talk about DevOps, the challenges that were the impetus for a lot of those major milestones and solutions early on and along the way, what that history looks like, and how those challenges have changed, before getting into features and promises that come out of DevOps and whether or not they really seem to be delivered, whether that's coming to giving you the kinds of assurances that it was intended to do in the first place, or in assuming or expecting a level of knowledge or expertise to really exercise DevOps, the level of automation that's really there to support the kind of workflow that it's exists to ensure, and then shifting there into GitOps and sort of what Platform SH is trying to do, or at least where we see actionable problems within this DevOps space being, and what are the ones worth focusing on to improve the lives of developers and collaboration and all applications that are developed between teams. And it all centers around the Git protocol, and you'll see this line, Git is the source of truth, a couple times in this talk. And once we have that, some tail end parts of the kinds of tooling that can be built on top of the more GitOps focused approach to development. Once we have so many of these things taken care of for us with these initial assumptions, but we'll get all to that. That's the basic outline for this talk, though. So for this first part, road to DevOps, like I said, not a super detailed history, more of overview of milestones, and I didn't start my timer. Overview of milestones and what are the challenges that the developer faces. And I don't need to tell you the challenges that you face, but I work for the DevRel team, so I spend a lot of time talking to individual developers, working with Platform, and over and over again, they have the same kind of components to it. We want to develop high-performing web applications quickly, in a secure way, in a repeatable, consistent way, without losing the kinds of assurances that we need for production when we make changes. Seems straightforward. Seems, with all of our familiarity with DevOps, many of the things that DevOps is supposed to solve. Workflow and collaboration, the ability to set aside areas to experiment on things, the ability to replicate production considerations and settings in areas that we can do that experimentation in a way that verifies that nothing will break. And then I think implicit within that whole hope, at least maybe on the developer side, but in the promise of DevOps, is that the amount of knowledge that it's going to take for a team of people to do this kind of work is going to be affected in a positive way. That somehow, through automation, through a redefinition of the problem space, how much a single developer needs to know and the expertise they need to have in order to develop a secure application, that they know the orchestration of things and could be assured production's probably not going to go down, and if it does, I know why and when and can do something about it without breaking other things. And the other part is cost, going from what I'll start with of the early days to some of what we have today. That's improvements of the enforcement and tooling around DevOps will get us to a place where more teams are able to do this just because the cost has changed in a dramatic way. I'm not going to talk on costs a ton in this talk, but we'll touch on it a couple points in here, just really because we go from an era of dedicated servers and, really only the biggest companies being able to do something with a workflow like that to the world of today with a lot more reasonable computing environments. So what's the first thing we see there? We see this 3-tier deployment model. And it's probably not unfamiliar, not because you're doing this in the same way as when it was conceived, but because it has some momentum behind it in splitting up steps. And so many of you are likely working in a workflow where there are separate testing, staging, and production servers, because it is an improvement there on what was before. Do you have enough funds and attention to maintain a production server and do things to it. So the first improvement is, let's solve the development workflow problem. Let's split development into these distinct stages with the purpose of having many areas before production where many of our team members can place eyes on the code changes and allow for review before it even has the chance to affect production. Preventing, hopefully the goal, disastrous changes being placed there. Excuse me. So setting up these distinct stages of the life cycle and tying it into review. So some clear boundaries. But in the early days, this was still expensive. If you got a production site, to have this kind of assurances, you have to have the funds to really to provision and run and maintain and update to production sites. Because otherwise, how do you have the assurance? The whole point of the staging server is providing you as close to a copy of production as possible, so that when you do your review and you try to catch bugs before it enters production, you have a good clone, a good copy, something that can mimic the production situation. And really, this was only the biggest companies that could afford something like this setup. And it got better, and people started implementing the staging server, but only the biggest of the biggest could have the separate testing server and any sort of way of coordinating what was on a local developer's computer to what may be on a testing server. And so we have developers on their computers falling behind what's in this workflow, introducing merge conflicts, making it harder and harder to actually merge something. This moving target of the testing server that every single developer is trying to keep up with. And as much as it tried to approach this problem of preserving production with a workflow, it created a little bit of an artificial path from me as an individual developer trying to get something from my fingertips on the keyboard to a production site by setting up this linear path that it had to go through first. It was good. It is good when it works because, like I said already, plenty of stages of review and assurances before it gets there. But let's say we have the team and everybody's trying to stick to this. We have a queue of features going through this path. And then we find out that there is a security fix that we need to apply to our production database. So what happens there? Do security fixes get blocked by something that's currently in the sort of final stages of review within this pipeline, but it's still not quite ready to merge today when we need this security fix placed in today for the sake of our site? And in a lot of cases, it was no. And so that leads to the development of the hot fix, which is we have this process. This is clearly a situation where the process doesn't work. So let's abandon the process and apply a change that we're now going to have to sort out backwards through this pipeline from now on. And, the answer isn't just use Git here. This is still pre-Git stages. And beyond how the workflow is affected, there's this whole other part of the ideal of setting up a staging, and if you could afford it, testing server. What do you do with data? Is there anything you can do with data here? Without production data, you can't measure the impact of a change that's in testing or staging. And it's not a trivial process at all of getting it there from production. So what we see is the introduction of this CI/CD, set of ideas. Push changes through this pipeline faster. Get changes integrated into tests as soon as possible. Get them through the pipeline and deployed as soon as possible, and automate those stages as much as possible along the pipeline, so that testing server has those tests applied to them, as same as staging with their own UAT and QA tests, and that advancement doesn't stall along the pipeline to try and eliminate the cases where a security fix has to be applied manually. Well, a feature is already tracking its way through the pipeline for us. Everything is tested and things do move a little faster. But, now we have things built up on top of the initial workflow model. And so it's expensive to implement for the same reasons that the earliest stages were. You still need the dedicated servers, and now you need the dedicated people that don't just understand how to maintain the hardware and the basic abstraction of this server is for this and this server is for this, but we're going to put one within that says within this stage, these are the tests that need to be applied. The subset of them need to be applied to the next stage. And we start to get the beginnings of orchestration and operations that dedicated experts need to be available to do. And otherwise, we see a lot of the same drawbacks that were in that stage. They're still there. We've really just said, can we add more tests and push this through the pipeline faster? As the beginning stages of DevOps. And they're improvements for sure. I'm not here to deny that CI/CD are bad things, but they're more like touchstone points with their own drawbacks that are the seeds for continued improvements in the development of this idea of DevOps. And with it, we lead to some new features and into some common vocabulary and common protocols, understanding, toolkits that build up this idea of DevOps. And the two most important ones, well, there'll be three, but the two that started are this ubiquity of Git across all projects. There was a time where this wasn't the case. VCS was a couple different alternatives that it was difficult to do something as simple as a branch. So people didn't do it that often. And so first part is it takes the buy-in and acceptance in a large way within a team, and then outside of that to say Git is the protocol that we're going to be using. With it, we can branch more often. We can pull to keep our code locally or in a staging server in sync with production as much as possible, and take care of that part of what's being blocked. And then the other is containers or virtualization in general, because it did start with virtual machines, or in the biggest way with virtual machines. So we have another adoption of an abstraction of the computer system that changes the relationship between building an environment from putting together hardware and having the expertise to do that to making it a writing software problem. And it really, really improved the CI, this general integration part, by making this automated testing stage a lot more efficient, removing a ton of burden on the human review that would be required there, and at least supporting the continuous advancement through the workflow that's needed to add the kind of speed to start to counteract some of these other points that I've talked about. But there are, I've kind of already said this, but there's things that are still left. Besides the improvements, we need dedicated people who can support the relationship between the initial test stage prod model and how that relates to branches and environments, and how those things are, now that we have Git, it's at least scriptable, but we need dedicated people to form that relationship and enforce it across the work of the rest of our team. So yeah, with that abstraction, it has to be an internal definition for every team potentially in these early days. And things can get faster, but it could still be stuck in this linear workflow, some of it by momentum and some of it just there's not quite enough assurances in containers on their own when it's an inbuilt system to find them so reliably to create as many environments as you want. It's still a little expensive. It's still relying on internal tooling. So we're stuck in the workflow and we're still hindered by its linearity in some way, even though we're picking up the speed here. And it doesn't have anything to do with data still. Whatever it was that I chose to do to take data from my production server to my staging and maybe my testing server still has to be replicated here. There's still maintenance, updates, writing in the first place, not to mention, hey, new team member, you're onboarding to help the operations team. Let me show you the big, massive stockpile of code that we use to keep this whole business afloat. These are still real challenges here in orchestration, and because of the need for experts, costs. As data, it becomes more audible, and we still have some promises that come with it, though. Once we have the introduction of not just Git and not just containers and virtualization, but we have the addition of cloud, of for the first time, cheaper environments that can be scripted and well-defined and provisionable and destructible on the fly. We have the beginnings of potential of nonlinear workflows. If we think of what we're looking at here as branches in a repository, we can imagine a situation where I would want this, but I need to apply a security fix. So I'm just going to create a branch off of production. There's a big gap between being able to do this, but this is the first component. I have the cloud, containers, and Gits that makes this stuff reproducible, disposable, and a lot cheaper than it was ever before. But it's not quite there yet. We're sticking to the tooling available, so we're sticking to 3-tier. And at the stage, we have a lot of promises. We have this hope that we're enabling a kind of incremental development that is going to make things faster. It's going to improve the way that we write software, and we're going to minimize the amount of time that it takes for any developer to focus their energy on a single feature just because of the speed that we've added. And we're going to get more regular feedback. This is good. We've got these hopes, and we've got Git container in the cloud, but we still have the major orchestration problem. We have a lack of connection between the more nonlinear way that developers are working with the tooling and workflow that has been settled into. And so that means there's a chair. That means it's the chair of the DevOps engineer to make the abstraction connection between branches and environments and data and providing the safe space for people to do things. That becomes the DevOps engineer. And in the creation of the single role should really highlight what it is that's really needed here, right? What is it that they need to do? They need to oversee, update, maintain all of environment orchestration. What's the relationship between a Git branch and an environment? How is everything kept in sync? Where is infrastructure defined? Is it a separate concept from the code base that's attached to the branch at some point? I think we're still not quite at the infrastructure as code, but so that means we still have to come up with a definition of it and how it's connected. Obviously, we're well into infrastructure as code now, but I'm talking early days. How's data defined? What's the relationship? How often are things resynced? What happens when we need to push something through or around the workflow? What are the assurances that we have in place for it? This is ops engineers and then DevOps engineers. This is what they're attending to. Yeah. So I like showing this figure sometimes just because it's a headache that maybe you've all seen before, but it paints a little bit of picture of what still is in some ways missing, and certainly was missing in the case of the milestones that I'm talking about. This is the AWS reference architecture for WordPress. And just looking at this, what I see is a lot of components that I, as an individual, don't understand off the bat enough to implement this myself. So I see time, I see energy, and I see time and energy that's not dedicated working on the WordPress app itself, which I'm not a DevOps engineer. I am somebody who knows some PHP. I'm somebody who knows some Node and Python and some experience with WordPress. I've been hired to do a thing with WordPress. So I'm kind of forced to put this in the background as the convoluted, knotted figure that it is, rather than deep dive into it. And that's not a great feeling, but that's where it is. What I also notice is I don't, off the bat, see any connection between all of this infrastructure and what it is I'm trying to do and the relationship between my work on a branch and the production site. I see what is a configuration for my production WordPress site, and I would expect a very similar figure to have to be maintained by my team's DevOps engineer with whatever tool he chooses, whatever tool they choose to use, and me trusting it and saying, hey, I need an environment to work on something. When can I get something into staging? When can I get something into our testing flow? And then this is what they will be responsible for at all time. And it'll be a full-time job. And I guess that the point is that that would be indicative of a problem, I guess, rather than a justification. That it doesn't necessarily need to be as complicated as this for the large majority of websites and for the large majority of developers. There doesn't have to be the gap between me as an individual developer not knowing where to start and seeing the time ahead of me that it would take for me to fully ingest this, let alone connect it to the branch that I'm working on mentally. And that it could be abstracted away considerably in a way that it helps those. Yeah, so those are the notes I have on there. But that isn't the case in a lot of ways. So we make ad hoc rules. So the same rules that I run into people at conferences and little get-togethers during conferences and meetup groups, or even just barriers that I'll see when people come into our Slack workspace. Deploying on Friday is something that doesn't happen. You don't deploy in peak seasons, and you stick to this workflow. And I think you could see the whole point of this is the orchestration of our environment and the provisioning of those environments and of all of our infrastructure depends on the workflow, and it's delicate, and it's an expertise-driven thing. And I'm not denying that at all. But me as the individual developer on the team, the people that I'm talking to, these are the sort of ad hoc rules that they come up with that all circle around preserve production at all costs. Production becomes a delicate thing. Innovation and experimentation in any sort of environment can become this delicate thing that breeds a little bit of apprehension to get into the workflow in the first place. Discouraging deployment and experimentation, and a lack of speed, not just in my apprehensiveness, but if I'm not deploying on Friday, I lose a day every week for the whole year. I lose changes that might need to happen or would legitimately improve user experience on and around peak seasons because I have these ideas, these rules in mind. And for me, I don't know about all y'all, like I got into developing as a tool set. I was within the psychological sciences. I was in education, in some, engineering and mathematics that wasn't specifically computer science. And so programming served a purpose there. And so entering the web development community is a very different change. And I had different needs as an individual. I needed to onboard fairly quickly and grasp a lot of pretty foreign ideas, and to enter into an environment that comes with it some degree of apprehensiveness isn't comfortable, and it's not always very helpful from a community standpoint of trying to get the expertise of other people around me, when one of the first things that's through all of it is that production is finicky or delicate, and there aren't the assurances in place that they're to do the kind of experimentation that I need, sort of what my brain needs to understand things. I think that's really, yeah. I mean, and it makes sense that these would exist, because who wants to risk losing customers during a peak season? And who's going to trust a website that crashes, doesn't work properly, or has a bunch of friction on it as a user? If user experience is terrible, who wants to go to that site? Who wants to spend money during Black Friday or whatever other season? The rules make sense, but they're, again, indicative of something else, I think. No, kind of said everything with the notes there. And so it's indicative, like I said, that some things are still hard. Development workflows are hard. Defining staging environments in the first place, and enough of them, is not built in and difficult in this moving problem. Alongside of that is data. Can we even reliably guess the effect of a change of any new feature without production data? Probably not. But if it's a non-trivial activity that's based off of a lot of internal scripts in order to make that happen, if it's not somehow built into our workflow, then how much assurance can we have that that's going to be done in any timely way to get changes into production or thrown away? How quick is that cycle if data is a difficult problem at every time, or an unknown one? Alongside of all this workflow, how's collaboration work? If there's apprehensiveness, can I move as quickly or as slowly as I need to as an individual to learn how the whole shebang works? How do I understand how the app works well enough to create a new feature or assess when there's a problem, if this is what I have to work with? Can I get the deeper understanding of how it works in order to really contribute quickly to any project? How do I keep the pace without breaking production? Really learn something, contribute, and have a team that learns from each other and helps each other. Because we're still people working on an application. This isn't just code. And I see friction here, and probably a problem. And I guess the only other thing to highlight here is this isn't specific to any language or framework or whatever. I mean, these are problems inherent in the development cycle that's been adopted by every language community. And yeah, tools have sprung up. We have Kubernetes, for example. But what is the level of expertise to learn Kubernetes and still have time to focus on changing the app, or Terraform, or whatever it is you might be using? I'm curious to hear. But how much time is dedicated to the understanding of, here is the environment to branch relationship that includes data and infrastructure, and the whole thing is a part of it. And then where does reliable, repeatable builds come into it, so that I can just focus on the work without it being a blind trust of a complicated process with a lot of faults in it that can fail. It's going to be the same thing in every programming language, I guess, that I'm saying. Don't see any chat yet. So I guess by this point, we get into this idea of GitOps, which is, we have a lot of good ideas so far. We have Git as the place that we work. It's trackable, revertible, auditable, highly identifiable by hashes, and it's a nonlinear protocol that's at its base, outside of the workflow that I've been showing, really compatible with the nonlinear way that groups of people work. It has problems because it's up to you to customize what those paths are, but at least provides enough flexibility to adapt to that. And we have containers in the cloud, highly reproducible, cheap, disposable computing units that can be very easily well defined by what we have committed in Git. So GitOps, it sticks an ops at the end of Git. So you could probably guess it leverages every bit of this Git protocol to do exactly that. The first part you're likely already familiar with. It's connecting infrastructure with what commits are on a particular branch. If a commit defines infrastructure in a particular way, that is what you get. That's what gets provisioned. And so it just depends on the tooling around it that's able to detect those definitions. It provides that one-to-one relationship on top of the protocol to fill in the remaining gaps once we get past solving the problem of infrastructure and branching, which we would then tie to individual environments, to then keep that same protocol and build on top of it. How do we manage secrets? How do we define and inherit environment variables between these branches? And then how do we handle data? And it can all kind of sit on top of this protocol that we're all using anyways, because we can just automate the rest. We relieve the pressure on sticking strictly to this workflow that isn't linear. That's not how people work. And then use the branches that are already there to make every branch effectively a development environment. And as I'll get into, effectively a staging environment, if we can build the way we handle data on top of it. We trust the commit, and we stick to the commit as far as what the infrastructure is. We branch, the same infrastructure is inherited. There you have your production infrastructure on the development environment. That gets taken care of for you effectively by a set of bash scripts around the Git protocol. And there's nothing different about that. This is still what DevOps engineers are doing, but it's deciding, I guess, on the abstraction layer that you want to apply in order so that you can understand the most as quickly as possible and continue to do your work. So you can touch it when you need to and not when you don't need to. I think you'll see in this figure too, an illustration of the problem that I said before. We have an integration environment with many features coming into it that can still be purely from our branching structure circumvented by a bug fix that needs to happen in production, and then relying on Git simply merge back down into the workflow and stay where you need to be. So what are its components? What are the basics? Git acts as the source of truth. We kind of already talked about that. Git is a place where we control environments, and it's provisioned with cheap containers using the committed infrastructure that's already exists in Git. This infrastructure is code. We talked about this as well. We can leverage pre-commit hooks to run validation on the infrastructure that's included inside of our committed configuration for whatever the service happens to be. Of course, I'll talk mostly about platform in my example, to then run the provisioning and tie it to that push, because then we can tie in assurances like nothing can happen to our application without a pushed commit. And things like our infrastructure hasn't changed across these series of commits and what assumptions we can make for that. Everything becomes observable, verifiable, and revertible because they are commits and that flexibility exists already in the protocol. And then, like I said, data gets built on top of it as a part of how Git handles inheritance. I've just reposted here what I had at the beginning. High performing web apps quickly, securely, consistently, without taking down production when changes are made. So I just wanted to bring it back so we keep it in mind to see how this stands up to that by itself. So did I say that these were the rules or the basics? I guess these are the context. So when we get into Platform SH, these concepts, Git as a source of truth, relationship between branches and environments, how data gets built on top, and then how we trust the individual commit as an identifying place, kind of manifest in some rules and relationships that we have here. So like I was just talking about, no change can be made without a commit. So a lot of what the workflow is put in place to solve is keeping the integrity of production. Because very, very early, and with some applications like WordPress, this is still the case, it expects some kind of ability to change the built environment at runtime. And I think we can all imagine the dangers that come with the freedom of something like that. You can make a change that could take down the production app like that, or it could take it down later, but it's not committed, so it's not something that can really be tracked. So we say, get the source of truth, nothing can be made without a commit. We'll see a couple examples here that pushes, merge, all of that become isolated activities in our project on an individual environment and set the pace for everything else. I touched on infrastructure as code, but also in saying that its purpose, it has a purpose. And the purpose isn't to spend all of your time figuring out how do I install and provision a MariaDB database, let alone how do I update the latest security patch. You know that you have a framework that's compatible with MariaDB 10.4 plus. That's what you know. So why does it need to be explained any more than that? It should be at that level of abstraction, and it should be a committed file as a part of your code base. You see this in a lot of other options, not just Platform SH. It's turning over to the idea that your infrastructure is a dependency of your application, just like any other, just like needing to use Yarn, just like needing to use requests. Any other dependency, infrastructure is a part of it. Your application depends on it. And so it provides the tooling then to say, this is a branch, it has MariaDB 10.4 and Node.js 14. Those are the containers that need to be associated with that branch's environment. And what's helpful too, as I said about security fixes, if we have an abstraction of MariaDB 10.4, then I really don't need to think about security patches, because that is something that's not going to introduce incompatible changes for the most part to my application. So I can trust the hosted service, something like Platform, to bump the patch version in the background so that I don't have to think about it. The other is we respect Git, so branches are environment. Legitimately, every single branch become a development environment. And like I pointed out before, these are development environments, but they're staging environments. We have Git, we have branching that we're respecting, branches to environments one-to-one if we'd like, but we can take snapshots of production data, and in the event of the branch, we can include along with it the snapshot of that production data. So it is not a SQL dump and upload that takes place in the creation of or in the testing of this environment. Each commit gets tested with production data from the moment it's branched, and we can resync production data at any time. So any test that we need to run using production data can be run on every single one of these environments. Nothing's blocked by the workflow too. You can see very clearly, I do not have a production, staging, testing, and then sub features outside of that workflow here. I could, and I could still circumvent it with the bug fix that we talked about, but I don't need to stick to that at all. I can group it by features. Not a problem at all. They still are identical when they start. They can be resynced at any time from that upstream. Yeah, and then I can just merge it back from my production site anytime any of these parallel independent paths make it into production. It's not a problem. And so data gets cloned. These aren't development environments anymore. They're legitimate staging environments. We get code, And we get, within that code, we get the infrastructure we've inherited for production. So we get identical production clusters with the same data in production. We have staging copies of our production sites on every environment that we want to test. The updating of a typo in a piece of body copy, doesn't matter how small or large the change is, we will get that exact copy of production sites. And they're isolated. They're just, we can leverage the containers and availability of these kind of computing resources to set up these isolated environments that maintain this relationship on top of Git without having them in this single tenant system where they're going to run into each other. Nor do we need them on the huge expense of having them on their separate servers either. Probably the most interesting part about this, of doing things this way, we make a commit, it has a unique identifiable hash associated with it. So you're going to get that for the individual commit. You can use that to track and blame changes through the commit history. But now that we've tied infrastructure to our repository, we've tied provisioning of environments with the containers defined in that infrastructure across our projects, we can do something like create a branch. So what happens there? We still have the same commit on the production site on our new environment. We haven't made any changes to it yet. And we know already that it's going to inherit all the code for our infrastructure, and it's going to inherit all of our data and all of our code. But what happens since they have the same commit hash? Well, we can just continuously save in the background build images associated with individual commits. So in the branch, we get data and code and a built image, and we don't actually have to rebuild that image during the branch operation, during the branch activity. We can just start work. And this is great because not only does it make that process quick, but it also means that we can use other elements of Git, like diffs. So I may very well find myself in a position where I've built a Drupal site, and we made the decision as a team that we want to add a JavaScript front end to that site. Okay, so I add another application into the same repository, and they're talking to each other. And at a certain point, I create a branch. And I make a change, but I'm only working on this new feature on the front end site. Every time I push a commit, it's going to rebuild that production site because that's what I'm working on. But it'll also be smart enough to recognize, it should be smart enough to recognize that the commit associated with changes on the Drupal site haven't changed throughout this entire pipeline of my work. So in the same way that as I branched, I don't have to rebuild because I'm going to reuse the build from current production, I don't have to continuously rebuild Drupal. I could just focus on the changes I have and work on diffs in my infrastructure. And so then I'm finished. I've made the changes to my front end site. I've been reusing the build on Drupal, and I've got my front end site to where I want. I click merge. Same thing. Now the tip of my default branch is sitting on the commit I previously had associated with the staging environment. And it's run through all my tests and all this production data that I've inherited. So when I merge, I could feel pretty sure that I could just take the same build image associated with that commit, move it over to production. So it takes away some of that apprehension then, right? I don't need to be scared of deploying Friday, deploying on any time of the year, because I have already deployed this image. I've run the gamut of tests on that specific image. All I'm doing is adjusting its association with the default branch instead of the development environment. And the only enforcements we need to take there is to say builds don't have any context of environments, of production, development, staging, or whatever, and that any time after this build stage is read-only. So it's not possible to adjust the build image aside from the commit that is pushed. So we can continue to reuse these hashes and move them all over the place. And we get a lot of power from this because it's very easy for me to go branch. I'm going to try out this feature over here. I get a new production site in a second. I'll do my things. If it doesn't work, I just throw it away. But if it does work, then I already have the full assurance, because I have an exact copy of production, that the only difference is the exact changes I made, and there's no rebuilding that site when a merge happens. So I think I've gone through most of these. The only other thing is rollbacks and reverts. Yeah, it makes merges easier, but because we have this unique idea associated with the commit, same reverse steps apply. I can open up a development environment, do the revert commit. There I have it. Previous state of the application that I've already built. Merge into production, we're already done. There's no putting back through our pipeline unnecessarily. There's no other headache. It's just part of the logic of Git already that I'm already using, and I'm just relying on Git completely. So at this point, I've tried to go through sort of the initial problems that got us into this stage of DevOps, dedicated servers, the beginnings of CI/CD, the ops engineer, DevOps engineer, and then sort of the problems that we at Platform see have the most impact on setting as restrictions. Place a little trust into the application of security patches, because it's an abstraction level that's actually more relevant to your work as an individual. Stick to Git, and then everybody does DevOps. That's really what GitOps is for. Infrastructure is taking care of you. Operations are taking care of you. You just rely on Git. And then you can spend all your time thinking about your application while having a good understanding, the onboarding experience. You're just saying, Git, here's the available versions of images. Here's how environment variable works. You already get data. Make me that feature. That's kind of what onboarding is like with this perspective. If we can just narrow out these couple of different left to solve problems. But is that enough all by itself? We're spending all of our time thinking about our app now. Are we crossing off that initial statement I had at the beginning? High performing web applications quickly, securely, consistently without taking down production. I think all that's left there is the high performing part, which is good, because with these few assumptions and this level of abstraction, we refocus the problem to all questions at the application level, right? We don't have to think about environments, orchestration, infrastructure, data. We just say, okay, well, I can add a submodule, or I can add a subdirectory with another whole application in it. Let me explore over here if decoupled or microservices is a good direction for us. Is it? It's passing all of our tests. Great. Is it not? Throw it away or leave it open and we'll come back to it later. We know the Git API. Can we enforce those standards across a fleet of sites? How do we get more assurances, better understand our performance of our application to write better tests and ensure that, all the operations are taking care of us, but how can we really be sure that we're not affecting user experience? And how do we monitor for negative effects before they happen? These are some screenshots from a tool that we have at Platform that's called Blackfire. Maybe you guys have heard about it. We partnered with them recently. We acquired them, and we are now one company. And part of the workflow at Platform is, or the story, I guess, is, okay, these are the things taken care of. What do you know about your app and the level of code that you're writing? Well, for every environment that's an exact copy of production with all of your production data with just the changes you've made to it, can I take a profile and track the function calls through my application to determine, hey, my Redis extension on Drupal 9 is contributing to 35% of the total load time of my web page. What's that about? Can I go investigate that? It's using a lot of memory. It's using okay CPU, but time and memory, that's something to investigate. So I can just incrementally develop in my own isolated place that's the focus of my time. I focus on features of performance rather than features of operations. And then I can use that in combination with insights about those calls that are making the greatest impact on my production site, to then write tests and scenarios that cover the gamut of what my users experience when they go through my application, to really make the greatest experiences possible, really enabled by the fact that GitOps allows you to not worry about all this stuff at the edges that is really everything except for your application, right? Focus on the app. Let's deep dive into the app as much as possible and focus on the experience of the application. And yeah, it creates its own little life cycle, where my life cycle could be introducing new features of the app. That same path has a loop within it that says, how does it stand up against our current measures of performance? Does it fail any of those tests that are now part of our CI suite? Yes, it does. Okay, investigate. Do we need to modify the tests, or do we need to change something in our application and the changes we're trying to merge? Continue the loop, refine the test, and improve the whole process for the user and for the development workflow. So you improve the workflow as you're going and get greater insight of how it all works for your team. Oh, okay. I did okay. I'm at the last 2 minutes there. I hope this was, I don't know, helpful. It's not quite a history lesson. It's more of, like I said, milestone of big things that you are likely already working with, already familiar with. But we as a company are kind of focusing on these few points that I already touched on. If we can rely on Git as much as possible and automate the tools on top of that at a level of abstraction that eliminates necessarily responsible the DevOps engineer individually, we create an environment where more people more often could be a part of the DevOps lifecycle and the process of thinking about the application. Say, these pieces of infrastructure are dependencies of the application. A branch can be any environment, so we think about how different environments could be handled differently, considering we can reuse builds and production data for the new feature that I'm working on. And then, like I just said, deep dive into the application itself within those isolated spaces. I really hope that doesn't come across as a sales pitch. It's always possible. But this is what I think about all the time. And the people that I talk to that come into our workspace or that I meet at talks usually tend to be thinking about the same thing. And, usually there's a piece of the abstraction we've chosen and the problems that we choose to work on specifically that can connect with some of the problems that people are researching or encountering with work. So I hope it's not a sales pitch. I hope you try Platform, because it's been tremendously helpful for me coming from the area of work that I was into web development, and helped me onboard, learn, grow, collaborate with so many great people and talk to so many great people about these ideas. No, but those are the rest of my notes. Thank you all. No, that is it. I appreciate you all coming. I hope that it was useful to you and entertaining, or at least enjoyable. So thank you all for coming.
There are some questions in the question tab chat if you want to answer.
Oh yeah. Okay, so the first question is, you're talking about production data in your staging environment. What about personal data we have on production? Is there a step for anonymization? Let's think here. You have a build phase that exists in isolation where you can affect the file system. Once that phase has finished and pre-deploy, that's when copies of the existing production containers are actually come online with that production data. So I guess the two answers would be, you could very well do something to your own data in the build and deploy phases. They're just a set of YAML, just like any other configuration you've seen for something like this. And so if you wanted to add a step like that, it would increase your deploy time, obviously, but it's something that you could configure as much as possible, because by the deployment stage, you do have logic of this is not production. This is a staging or development type of environment. But otherwise, these services that you have, I guess I didn't really get too deep into the secure aspects of it, other than how they are themselves isolated. But if I were to, like the example I said about, or I guess I'll stick with yours. I have a Drupal application and a database. The only way for Drupal to gain access to that database is by an explicitly defined relationship. And the only way for that Drupal app to be seen by the outside world is by an explicitly defined root. So by default, these database containers don't exist in a place where they can actually be accessed by anyone in the outside world. So if your concern is, say, a developer within the team being able to get into the database container and see personal data, that would be something you would either have to implement yourself as part of the deploy, or something that you would have to run through our built-in sort of vault service when you are saving in the first place. But otherwise, you have the assurance of like true isolation. There's nothing exposed without explicit definition. This includes, access to the container. You can set permissions within that SSH environment in that same YAML file. We still keep that part of the abstraction. I don't know if that's helpful. Thanks, Sylvian. Second question, do you think that we can implement GitOps in a non-GitOps production environment? Well, I don't know if I totally understand the question, but one thing that we do at Platform that might fit for your question is we have the concept of an enterprise deployment. So what I was showing inside, let's see if I can go back to the figure here. So each one of these environments is isolated, and our configuration defines how a virtual cluster of containers is provisioned that is our application. And so it gives us the ability to move up this chain and substitute out these hashed build images at each branch or merge that may take place. But we also have this other aspect of our product that's enterprise that is kind of adjacent. It's connected to these, but it acts as the production environment, and it gives you this the assurance of a dedicated server rather than being on this shared grid, tons of containers all over the place that are put in a more efficient way together that characterizes all of these kinds of projects. It essentially has one of those, but then as soon as it gets to production, it exists in a traditional dedicated server, 3 virtual machines, abstraction type of thing. So it's not quite connected GitOps that way because you can't quite push to that. And it has a very different hardware specification there. Yeah, Is that a good answer, Ronald? I'm having trouble because you're saying in the production environment, the non-GitOps production environment. If you can give me any more. Oh, I see you typing. Yeah. So for us, the dedicated servers is restricted purely to the production environment, and there's no protocol of branching and merging within there. They're kind of the isolated production environment, and then everything that I'm talking about here that gets promoted from a development or staging environment to that production place that's dedicated. So you can kind of have the upsell sort of dedicated version that's a dedicated production and staging server for those specific environments, but otherwise they exist in this kind of grid space. No, your whole project does exist on a dedicated place. It's the same logic. I guess I was struggling with the production part of it. Each one of these projects exists in a dedicated space for those customers, sure, but not by default. Okay, sorry about that.
Okay, does everyone have any other question they want to ask before we end the Malta Academy? I guess it's all right now. Oh. Okay. I just had a bit of problem with my connection. So maybe we can conclude. Thank you very much for all of you for attending to this Malta Academy, and also a very special thank you for Chad for hosting this Malta Academy. It was very interesting. I hope everyone find it interested as well and complete. If you want to see other Malta Academies on various subjects, you can visit our website that is just here appearing on the screen, maltaacademy.com. And if you like to do the same as Chad and also host a Malta Academy, please feel free to send us a topic by clicking on the button Become a Speaker. And again, if you haven't seen the beginning of the Malta Academy, don't worry, there will be a replay that will be sent to you by email. And you can also go on our website, maltaacademy.com, where you can find the replay as well and other kind of topics if you want to. And on that note, thank you very much, Chad, again for the Malta Academy. I have a bit of connection problem.
Oh. Am I the host now? Is everybody still here? Thank you all for coming. Looks like Chloe dropped off there. If I'm still on here, thank you all. Feel free to reach out on our main site. Check out our Slack. You can find me there, chad.carlson. Let me know if you have any questions. I'll hang out a bit in the chat here in case you guys do. But otherwise, have a great rest of your day. Thank you for coming.